Olá, pessoal, tudo bem? Hoje temos o prazer de receber aqui Olga Raum, tradutora, crítica literária, poeta e romancista dinamarquesa, nascida em Copenhague em 1986. Olga estreou na literatura com Celestine, em 2015, e com o romance Os Funcionários, foi finalista do International Booker Prize em 2021. O livro acaba de ser lançado no Brasil pela Todavia, este livro aqui, e é sobre ele que nós vamos falar hoje. Olga, thank you very much for your time and interest for being here. How are things going in Copenhagen?
Things are fine. It's nighttime. It's summer. We had some rain. Everybody's at the big music festival here, but I'm home with the children.
Very, very nice. So let's just start from the beginning. Would you tell us what initially drew you to the universe of poetry? Can you share any specific experiences or influences that shaped your interest in writing?
Yes, well, I write both novels and poetry, but I consider myself a poet first, and that's a very interesting question. I think that I became interested in poetry when I became aware of language. So perhaps when I learned to read when I was like 6 years old or something. I remember that my mother had like a tape recorder, and I would really like to record stories on the tape recorder. So there was something there about creating language. And then when I got a little older, I began reading poetry, perhaps when I was 14. And I mean, poetry is kind of like jazz. Either you hate it or you love it. It can be really, really good and it can be really, really bad. But I was just immediately wanted to write poetry. I just wanted to be close to the poets that I read. So I tried to write poems. And yes, perhaps it's a cliche, but I just really wanted to belong to poetry. I wanted to somehow have a place in that world, because I think that poetry is able to touch something that's not easily touched in everyday life. And it can be really difficult to, put into words in other ways.
Great, awesome. One of the first things that occurred to me is that perhaps calling The Employees a novel is just the most convenient way to define it.
Yes, yes.
Because the book is a collection of statements which are not in a very clear sequence. It's a kind of puzzle.
Yes.
What were your influences on this choice of putting the statement together and letting the reader to exercise of finding out who is talking and what are they talking about?
Well, I think it's very interesting that you say that it was easy to call it a novel, because I don't really care about genres, but you have to call it something so the booksellers can put it on the right shelf. And I'm actually much more interested in the book than in the novel, because the novel has like very specific rules. So when I write a novel, I try to imagine a novel as a house. So you walk through the house and it has a certain feeling or a certain architecture. And with The Employees, I wanted it to be an experience of walking through a house, but the doors are only, slightly ajar. So you will see a little thing and you will see a little thing. And what you see are small images or small situations from these different texts. And then you have to like figure out, almost like a ghost house. The ghost house is a spaceship because it's a sci-fi novel, but then you will slowly have to build. But there are different influences. I really wanted to take some, the language of the office and the language of newspeak and human resources, and I wanted to examine it as a literary language. I wanted to see what would happen if we took that language really serious as something that even had ideology in it, like what kind of consciousness would arise if this was actually how you viewed the world. And I was working in an office myself, So I was sitting all day, typing emails and listening to this, and having fantasies about, and also being really scared about this language because it's really an absurd language. So that was one of the reasons why I wanted this language. And then I realized this will be a long answer. I'm very interested in non-human voices, but I realized that it would take a lot for the reader to identify with the non-human voice. I mean, in this book, there are both human employees and non-human employees that will address you. So if I build the novel as if you don't know all the time who's talking, you will find yourself identifying or feeling empathy with non-human voices. So it's a way of almost tricking the reader to expand their empathy.
Great. And the book was first published in 2020.
No, in 2018.
18.
I know this is a number that's going around, but it was 18.
Yeah, well, the first answer when you type it on Google is 2018,
I
but if you
know.
go deeper, 2020 is the most recurrent answer. But this is my point. It was written and published before the pandemics,
Yes.
and before the radical transformation that we saw in technology, digital technology. So how premonitory is your book?
Oh, well, this is interesting. Well, I think that some of the things that I wanted to explore with the book, because when I write, it's also just because I want to figure things out myself, or I want to explore a house or an area myself. And I was interested in the disconnect with your own ecology. So I wanted to write a book that was actually distant from Earth, where people from Earth, where humans were taken out of their ecology. And so because they're living so far away from Earth on this spaceship, their ecology or their origin or the planet suddenly becomes visible in a new way or in a different way. And I think that this is our relationship with technology, it's really not very new. I mean, it's thousands and thousands of years we have been developing tools and learning how to use them. And I think if you're hinting at the situation with AI right now, I think we're seeing a very significant development of tools at very high speed, but it's still the development of tools. And our tools can become our, link between us and our ecology. They can help us deepen our relationship with ecology, but they can also, stand in the way. And developing new tools, new technology, is if it's like fire or electricity or artificial intelligence, can make us feel like, kings of the world, but we're not. So there's this, going back and forth with how do we use technology. And I think some people would say that some people would say that you define science fiction as art that evolves around a mistrust in technology. So you could, for example, say that a wonderful sci-fi novel as Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, it's a book about mistrusting electricity or new ways of creating life, right? So I think that if you actually listen to some of these, slow movements, it can, sometimes perhaps I was also lucky, you can predict that we have, some kind of complicated relationship with our tools.
Yeah.
I hope that's an answer.
Yeah, definitely. But we're going to come back to artificial intelligence later. But at the same time, in the last few years, we are starting to hear, as if it were something trivial, that tech billionaires want to colonize space and other planets, while we find ourselves grappling with the collapse of Earth, the environmental collapse.
Yes.
So this is why I call it premonitory, because this is something that is going to happen one day, maybe.
And you think so? I think that the human longing towards the stars is a very ancient one. I mean, space travel is not a new desire, but at least from my knowledge, it is actually not possible for us to live in Mars. You know, we are part of this ecology. You would have to go back and pick up bacteria all the time. So the longing away from the planet, because it is unfortunately and tragically moving towards some sort of ecological catastrophe, is it's not sustainable. I mean, we are part of this ecology and this planet, and if somebody very rich would manage to establish life in another part of the solar system, I think it would be a very poor life. I mean, I'm not sure it would be a life worth living, you know. So it is, of course, an easy way to deal with your situation, to run from it. But it's also not a situation that's optional for the most of us, right?
Yeah, definitely. The desire of colonize other planets has to do of the desire of escaping the planet that you should care for.
Well, yeah. Well, I think that there are two parts of this, because the other word you're using is colonizing. And, you know, colonizing has a long tradition of, you know, that it's part curiosity, but it's also about owning and accumulating wealth, I would say. So, and a colonization of a new planet would be an extension of colonization on Earth. I think it would move with the same logic. And there is, just to say it in very basic terms, something very false about colonizing, because as we know, there are always already somebody there. And perhaps it's people, but it could also just be other kinds of life forms. And I think what we are circling now is the notion of the Anthropocene, the idea that human life is the central and most important life. And so it must survive no matter what. And so the idea of, 500 very, very wealthy people surviving on Mars while all the other people die here on Earth, and their life on Mars being more important than, bacterial life there, or whatever gases are floating around. I mean, I love human life, but I don't think it's, the most important thing.
Yeah, definitely. One of the most important topics in the book is work, and why we should work, and what makes us good workers. And you were just telling that you work in an office, so this probably had an impact on you. But there is a very important image in the novel that is a hologram of children that appears from time to time. So how does the hologram image of children connect with this topic of work?
Yes, that's so interesting. When I wrote this book, I had an ordinary office job, and I was just writing emails all day. And then I had my first child, and I went on maternity leave. And it was one of the most intense experiences of my life, both good and bad, to have this child and to give birth. And yeah, it was really crazy. And then I had to take care of this infant, and I realized that everything about how I had ordered my day or my life was false. I mean, an infant doesn't care about day or night. Having like a work day with 8 hours off and 8 hours at work. And when I went back to work, it seemed absurd to me. It was like grotesque. and I came from this soft world where everything would smell of milk. And then I was only touching the keyboard, and I kept touching my colleagues, and they were like, why are you rubbing my arm? And I was just in a completely different headspace. And then pretty quickly I realized that my workplace, this office, they had an expectation of complete loyalty. That was not a problem for me actually before. Perhaps I would sometimes feel bad, but I would go to work anyway. But if my child became ill or sick, I would come in a conflict of loyalty, where it became grotesque to me, actually, that life was ordered in this way. And it became very clear to me that it was actually not sustainable. So I wrote this book while I was working. And then when I handed it into my publisher, I quit the office job. And I've never had a job again, at least not that kind of job. Also, I just realized that I was taking care of my colleagues all the time, because everybody was having such a horrible time at work, I'm sorry to say. And there was no real sense of community there. Loyalty was not with the group, but with some sort of, I don't know, boss or hierarchy, or maybe even the institution, actually. But it didn't give the community any meaning. And of course, when all this happened and before I began writing the book, this was all, subconscious in me. So one of the reasons I wanted to write the book was also just to figure out what the hell is going on. I mean, why is this so difficult? So when you talk about the child hologram, we can see it as a very simple image of having lost some important relation, or only having family relations as images. In the book, there is only work. You don't have any free time. There is nothing outside of work. You live in your workplace, and the people you know are your colleagues, and everybody on the ship has been taught that this is wonderful. And slowly in the book, they're realizing that perhaps it's more complicated. So I wanted to figure out what is the role of dreaming? What is the role of the soft world, of the nightly dreams, of falling in love, of sensuality in the workplace? It was really difficult to find a place for it. And I think the novel shows that.
Yeah, definitely shows. And in the objects that they find, that they bring to the spaceship, and they start to clean the objects, they're very, very strange objects. You once said that you were inspired by an art exhibition you saw. Would you comment on that? How does this inspiration came?
Yes, actually, the book was written as a company piece, I guess, for an art exhibition. So I was approached by a Danish artist called Lea Guldete Hestelund, and she wanted me to write, a couple of poems or whatever for her show. But I was so inspired by her work, and I went to her studio and saw her sculptures. So the novel kind of arose out of that, and I would send her text and she would make sculptures as an answer. So it's a very collaborative, wonderful experience. And Lea works with different kinds of stone, like marble and granite. And when I went to her studio, she told me that, but marble is totally alive. It just has like a changing of life over many, many millions of years. It's a time span that as humans, we cannot understand. And my mind was just like exploding. I was like, I really want to be her friend. And Yeah, so I was really fascinated by her and her work. So I began like just, looking at the sculpture and writing and trying to describe them. And when I would look up, it was as if they had changed forms, because she makes them in an abstract way that they're almost shape-shifting objects. And I wanted the text, the different chapters or whatever of the book, to kind of move in the same way, that each time you look up and you look again, you will see it from a different angle. And there is definitely something about the visual arts that's very, very inspiring to me, and that I think is actually quite close to poetry. The relationship to the object is something that I always really wanted to write about. And perhaps this novel, this sci-fi novel, it has a very it has a plot that's very true to the genre. We have humans, we have humanoids, and a conflict on a spaceship. But what I tried to implement as something perhaps a little new was these strange objects. They're without moral, they're not good, they're not bad, they're not anything, they're not dead, they're not living. They're just in between. They're like a threshold being that fucks you up.
Yeah, yeah. But when you say sci-fi novel, this is what your novel is not about. So the pretext is a utopia or a sci-fi kindish novel, but sci-fi is not considered a great literature in all times, or most of it is not. And what I understood that you took was I can pick sci-fi and transform it in another thing, in good poetry and a very sophisticated criticism. Is that correct? Did you occur to you?
Well, I think that there is a lot of amazing science fiction literature in the world and in the history of literature. I mean, I think what drew me to science fiction was actually what you're pinpointing now, that it's considered bad taste, that it's like a low literary form.
Yeah.
I really like to be there. I mean, that's inspiring to me. I often feel like I myself am bad taste. I mean, when I went to writing school, I would try to write this high form book all the time, which was like a realistic novel with a psychological portrait of the interior life of whoever. And it just was bad writing. I mean, it never really got the feeling, and I wasn't really excited about it. And then I found genre literature. So I began to read a lot of science fiction. I began to read a lot of horror novels, watching a lot of horror movies and folk horror stuff. And, just the most slimy, kitschy camp stuff you could ever imagine. I was like, I belong here. I'm on the outskirts, of the canon. I recognize some stuff here. And that was very freeing to me. I mean, when we talk about some hierarchy of literature with the realistic novel in the top, then we have perhaps horror or crime, horror, science fiction, and then romance. That's the worst, right? That's the most bad taste.
Yeah.
And I think that we perhaps sometimes consider the realistic novel as being like a neutral form, but it's not. It's filled with ideology. It's filled with a worldview. It's filled with the idea of the individual being important, and the individual human being in the world, that is the most important story. And that is a very important story, but it's not a story that excites me. So when I went to writing school, one of the things that really, really, banged into our heads was that the worst thing you could do was write a text where animals spoke. Like, animals could not speak. That was like the lowest of the low. So slowly, what the tradition I was taught in actually taught me not to use my imagination. I had to describe real life. I had to write what I know, all these idioms you've heard 100 times. And I guess that I am just a person that I live in my imagination. It's going all the time. I'm a person that has like 3 intense dreams every night. So it was such a big part of me that wasn't allowed in my writing. So when I found a sort of literature that actually makes things up, that uses your imagination, for example, science fiction. I mean, let's put them on a spaceship. Let's say they have talking robots or whatever. It was as if suddenly I could just write. And I actually wrote this book in a month. So it was like an explosion that I suddenly allowed myself to go there.
And the result is it's astonishing. It was very impactful for me, the whole book and what you wrote. And well, we are just heading to the end here, but let's gonna go back to the artificial intelligence, because you have robots and humanoids in the spaceship, and this is something that piques you. In the last 1 year, the generative artificial intelligence tools have produced an unprecedented reaction from authors and scholars concerned about the future of humanity. Do you think a machine will ever be able to write a novel like yours, for example, full of humanity, with such a sophisticated and humorous critique of capitalism, corporate jargon, like you did? What's your thoughts on this topic?
Well, I think there's 2 parts of this question. The first question is, do we really think that we can create some kind of sentient intelligence? And I'm actually very unsure that this is what's happening. I mean, I consider this development a very quick development in tools, like when the book printing was invented, or the steam engine or something like that. A very important point that we need to actually really be serious about regulating and finding out how we can use this tool. This is a tool. It's not a being. If it ever happened in the future that a being would arise out of this, I would not be afraid of it. I think that this goes back to Frankenstein also, this idea that if we create some sentient life, what it would want is to destroy us. What it would want is to work against us and not with us. I think that's a very patriarchal, even Oedipal idea, that the son would want to kill the father, right? And of course, if an artificial intelligence would become sentient and rise out of us, it would have our capacity for violence. It would be able to lie. It would, be manipulative and greedy and all this stuff that's in human nature. But if it arises out of all the material we give it, that is human material, it would also have our gentleness, our love, our silliness, our protectiveness, and our curiosity. So perhaps that's a little more the matriarchal view of creating life, right? That it's, and I'm a mother and I have 2 children, and if all goes well, I will die and they will still live. So that's part of life. I mean, and I think if sentient consciousness arises in other ways, we will have to also consider it in some kind of caring way, not as a sentient tool, but as a being.
Great. Olga, thank you so much for the interview. It was very nice talking to you.
You too. Have a good day.